The woman who inherited the greatest fortune on earth did not spend her final years inside a mansion. She spent them inside a hotel. Every Friday, another bill arrived, and every Friday it had to be paid. Few of the guests walking through the lobby recognized the quiet woman who passed them in silence. 30 years earlier, newspapers had followed her every move. Servants had waited for her arrival. Presidents knew her name. Europe's greatest intellectuals welcomed her into their homes. She had once possessed almost everything money could buy. Now she measured what remained 1 week at a time. How does the daughter of the richest man in history arrive there? The answer begins long before the fortune stopped protecting her. It begins inside one of the most disciplined homes America had ever known. While other millionaires displayed their wealth for the world to admire, John D. Rockefeller believed money was a responsibility before it was a privilege. Breakfast began exactly on time. Prayers came before every meal. Waste was unacceptable. Even his children were expected to account for every dollar they spent. Visitors expected unimaginable luxury. Instead, they found extraordinary discipline. Among those children was a quiet little girl named Edith. She listened more than she spoke. She watched people carefully. She noticed the things everyone else overlooked. She wondered why some people smiled while carrying invisible pain. She wondered why happiness seemed to disappear without warning. She wondered why money solved so many problems, yet failed to answer the most important questions about being human. Those questions followed her into adulthood. Years later, she became one of America's most admired young women. She was intelligent, cultured, musically gifted, and spoke several languages. Society watched her every appearance. Newspapers admired her elegance. Then she married Harold Fowler McCormick, heir to another American fortune. Their marriage united two of the wealthiest families in the nation. People called it the perfect union. The future appeared limitless. Their Chicago home overflowed with music, conversation, distinguished guests, and eventually the laughter of children. Servants would later remember something unusual about Edith. Although she could have entrusted every responsibility to others, she insisted on being present. She read bedtime stories herself. She comforted nightmares herself. She celebrated birthdays herself. Money could hire nurses, tutors, and governesses, but Edith wanted her children to remember something far more valuable than wealth. She wanted them to remember their mother. Looking back through the surviving family photographs, those years appear almost perfect. Beautiful gardens, elegant clothing, smiling faces, children running across immaculate lawns beneath enormous trees. History has a strange way of making happiness look permanent only after it has vanished. No photograph captured the moment everything changed. No newspaper reported it. No one inside that magnificent home recognized its importance. It began on an ordinary morning in February of 1901. Edith's 3-year-old son, John, was playing quietly when his nanny noticed 3 tiny red spots beneath his right ear. She wasn't alarmed. Children develop rashes all the time. She gently washed the area, changed his clothes, and expected the marks to disappear before bedtime. Instead, they spread. By evening, the rash had reached his chest. The following morning, it had climbed toward his face. A doctor was summoned immediately. He examined the little boy without speaking. The room became unnaturally quiet. Then he looked directly at Edith and spoke 2 words every parent feared hearing at the beginning of the 20th century: scarlet fever. The doctor's diagnosis spread through the house faster than the disease itself. Within minutes, servants stopped talking above whispers. Curtains were drawn. Visitors were quietly turned away at the front door. In 1901, scarlet fever was one of the most feared illnesses in America. There were no antibiotics, no miracle drugs. Parents understood that once the fever took hold, hope often surrendered to prayer. Edith refused to surrender. She remained beside John's bed through long days and even longer nights, cooling his forehead with damp cloths, reading stories he was now too weak to follow, and searching his face for the smallest sign of improvement. Harold summoned the finest physicians money could find. Specialists arrived carrying leather bags filled with instruments that offered little comfort against a disease medicine barely understood. Every new doctor brought another opinion. None brought certainty. The little boy who had filled the halls with laughter only days earlier now struggled to lift his head from the pillow. Nurses measured his temperature hour after hour while the household waited in agonizing silence. Outside, life continued as though nothing had happened. Streetcars rolled through Chicago. Businessmen hurried to meetings. Society pages printed stories of parties and galas. Inside the McCormick home, however, time had almost stopped. Every ticking clock seemed louder than the one before. Every footstep in the hallway made Edith look toward the bedroom door, hoping someone carried better news. None ever did. Days later, the fever finally broke, but not in the way everyone had prayed for. John slipped away before his 4th birthday. The grief that settled over the family could not be measured by newspaper headlines or the size of the Rockefeller fortune. It was the grief of two parents who suddenly found an empty bedroom where laughter had once lived. Friends arrived with flowers. Clergymen offered words of comfort. Letters of sympathy poured in from across the country. Yet every evening Edith returned to the same question that has haunted parents throughout history. Could she have done something differently? Wealth had purchased magnificent homes, private railcars, the finest education, and the best physicians available anywhere in America, yet could not buy one more day with her son. It was the first time Edith came face to face with a truth that would shape the rest of her life. There are tragedies before which money stands completely powerless. Those closest to her noticed the change almost immediately. She smiled less. Music no longer filled the house as often. Long moments of silence replaced conversations that had once come easily. But life, relentless as ever, continued moving forward. Her daughters still needed their mother. Social obligations returned. Charitable work resumed. From the outside, it appeared that the family had slowly recovered. That appearance would prove dangerously misleading. Grief has a remarkable ability to hide beneath routine, waiting patiently until the next loss tears open wounds that never truly healed. Edith devoted herself even more intensely to her children, determined that love would protect what wealth never could. She watched them more closely than before. Every cough caught her attention. Every fever raised quiet fears she rarely shared with anyone. Friends thought she had simply become an attentive mother. They could not see that fear had quietly become a permanent resident in her heart. Years later, that fear would return without warning, and when it did, it would not come for a son. It would come for a daughter whose bright smile had become the center of Edith's world, forcing her to confront a second heartbreak that no parent should ever be asked to endure. Years passed, and the McCormick household slowly learned to smile again, but grief has an unusual way of changing a family. It rarely announces its presence. Instead, it settles quietly into ordinary moments, reminding parents that joy can disappear without warning. Edith became even more devoted to her children. She attended their lessons, listened carefully to their dreams, and treasured the smallest family rituals that others often overlooked. Every birthday felt like a victory. Every Christmas carried deeper meaning than before. Friends admired her unwavering dedication, believing time had softened the wound left by John's death. They were mistaken. Grief had not disappeared. It had simply become invisible. Then, just as life seemed ready to reward the family's resilience, another cruel blow arrived. This time it was not a little boy who became ill, but Muriel, Edith's bright and spirited daughter. Unlike John's sudden illness, Muriel's condition unfolded gradually, giving the family something that can sometimes be more painful than shock itself: hope. There were good days when her laughter returned, and doctors cautiously encouraged optimism. Then came difficult days that erased every sign of progress. Edith found herself living inside a relentless cycle of hope and disappointment, celebrating the smallest improvements while quietly preparing herself for outcomes no mother ever wishes to imagine. Harold once again searched for the finest specialists. Consultations followed consultations. Treatments were recommended, abandoned, and replaced by new ideas that promised more than they delivered. Wealth once again opened every door medicine could offer, but beyond those doors stood a reality no fortune could negotiate. Edith spent countless nights sitting beside Muriel's bed, reading aloud even after her daughter had drifted to sleep. Sometimes she simply watched her breathe, as though memorizing every peaceful moment before morning arrived. Those who knew Edith later recalled that she seemed to carry two lives at once. Outwardly, she remained composed, gracious, and dignified, fulfilling the expectations placed upon one of America's most recognizable women. Inwardly, she had become a mother engaged in a private battle against a fear she could never fully escape. Every parent understands the instinct to protect a child. Edith possessed every imaginable resource to do so, yet each passing day reminded her of a truth that haunted even the wealthiest families. Love cannot always prevent loss. As Muriel's condition worsened, the atmosphere inside the home changed once again. Conversations became quieter. Laughter grew infrequent. Even the servants instinctively moved through the halls with unusual gentleness, as though the house itself understood that another storm was approaching. Then came the day every family dreads. Muriel was gone. The second funeral felt different from the first. When John died, Edith believed tragedy had visited her family. After Muriel, she began to wonder whether tragedy had chosen to stay. Friends struggled to find words that could possibly comfort a mother who had now buried two children. Most eventually stopped trying. They embraced her in silence because silence often speaks more honestly than language ever can. It was during this period that Edith's questions began changing. She was no longer asking doctors why disease existed. She was asking questions that medicine could never answer. Why do some lives end so early while others continue? Is death truly the end of a relationship between parent and child? Can love survive beyond the limits of a single lifetime? Those questions would eventually lead her thousands of miles from Chicago, away from the expectations of American society toward Europe, where one of the 20th century's most controversial thinkers believed the human mind held answers that conventional science had barely begun to explore. The journey that followed surprised almost everyone who knew Edith Rockefeller McCormick. Society expected a grieving mother to retreat quietly into charity work or private life. Instead, she began searching for answers in places few Americans of her generation would have considered. Europe became her refuge, not because she wished to escape Chicago, but because she believed someone, somewhere, might understand the questions that had consumed her since losing her children. Those questions eventually brought her to Switzerland and into the circle of a physician whose ideas were both admired and fiercely criticized. His name was Carl Jung. While much of the medical world focused on treating the body, Jung believed the deepest wounds often lived within the mind and the human spirit. He spoke about dreams, symbols, the unconscious, and the possibility that grief carried meaning beyond what science could measure. To many people, his theories sounded unconventional. To Edith, they sounded like the first honest attempt to answer questions that medicine had left untouched. Their conversations stretched far beyond illness. They explored memory, faith, fear, purpose, and the mysterious ways human beings search for healing after devastating loss. Edith immersed herself in Jung's work with extraordinary dedication, attending lectures, participating in discussions, and surrounding herself with thinkers who believed the human mind still contained unexplored frontiers. Friends noticed a remarkable transformation. She seemed energized by ideas rather than possessions. Books gradually replaced social calendars. Intellectual conversations became more important than fashionable gatherings. Yet not everyone viewed this change with admiration. American newspapers, always eager for sensational stories involving the Rockefeller family, began portraying Edith's interests as strange, eccentric, even dangerous. Headlines questioned her judgment. Society columnists whispered that grief had driven her into bizarre philosophies. Some reporters wrote as though a wealthy widow seeking answers was somehow more newsworthy than the questions she was asking. Few readers realized how unfair that portrayal was. Today, many of Jung's ideas have profoundly influenced psychology, psychotherapy, literature, education, and the study of personality. At the time, however, associating with him invited criticism from people who dismissed anything they did not immediately understand. Edith accepted that criticism without abandoning her search. The opinions of strangers mattered less than the hope that somewhere within those conversations she might find peace. Meanwhile, another part of her life was quietly unraveling. Her marriage to Harold had begun changing years earlier. At first, the differences appeared manageable. Harold devoted increasing amounts of energy to business, aviation, and public life, while Edith became increasingly absorbed by intellectual pursuits and personal reflection. They still respected one another, but respect alone cannot always bridge two lives moving in different directions. Conversations became shorter. Shared interests became fewer. They often found themselves living under the same roof while traveling entirely different emotional roads. Friends sensed the distance long before either of them acknowledged it publicly. Eventually, the marriage that had once symbolized the union of two great American dynasties reached an ending few had imagined possible. Their divorce shocked high society. Newspapers covered every development, transforming private sorrow into public spectacle. Once again, Edith found herself at the center of headlines she had never sought. Many observers blamed Young for influencing her decisions. Others blamed Harold. Still others invented explanations that made better stories than they made history. The truth was undoubtedly more complicated. Relationships rarely collapse because of a single event. They slowly drift apart through hundreds of moments too small to notice until one day the distance between two people has become impossible to cross. Edith walked away from the marriage carrying something far heavier than public criticism. She carried decades of accumulated grief, unanswered questions, and the growing realization that even extraordinary wealth could not preserve the life she had once imagined. Yet her greatest test still lay ahead, waiting quietly in the years to come, when the fortune that had seemed limitless would begin slipping away, forcing the daughter of America's first billionaire to confront a future no one could have predicted. The divorce marked the end of one chapter, but it did not end Edith's search. If anything, it deepened it. She no longer measured success by invitations to society dinners or the size of the estate she owned. She measured it by something far more difficult to obtain: peace of mind. While many members of America's wealthiest families invested in larger homes, grander parties, and growing fortunes, Edith devoted increasing amounts of her time and resources to understanding the human mind. Friends watched as libraries replaced ballrooms, scholars replaced celebrities, and thoughtful conversations replaced fashionable gossip. To some, she appeared to be reinventing herself. To others, she seemed to be drifting farther away from the world into which she had been born. The newspapers preferred the second version. They described her fascination with psychology as an obsession. They questioned her judgment, mocked her beliefs, and portrayed her as another wealthy heiress who had lost touch with reality. Sensational headlines sold newspapers. Quiet truth rarely did. What those articles almost never mentioned was that Edith continued supporting education, charities, music, and cultural institutions throughout these difficult years. Nor did they explain that many of the ideas being ridiculed would later become respected areas of psychological study. History often treats pioneers unfairly while they are alive, only to recognize their influence decades later. Yet public opinion has a way of leaving scars, especially when it follows someone already carrying private grief. As the years passed, Edith's financial situation also began changing in ways few outsiders understood. Wealth, even extraordinary wealth, is not always endless. Large estates required enormous maintenance. Staff had to be paid. Properties demanded constant attention. Investments rose and fell with changing markets. Philanthropy continued. Legal settlements from the divorce altered financial realities. Gradually, almost unnoticed at first, the lifestyle that had once seemed permanent became increasingly difficult to sustain. One by one, possessions disappeared. Homes were sold. Collections were reduced. The magnificent Villa Turicum, once envisioned as a place of beauty and intellectual exchange, eventually passed into other hands. To strangers reading newspaper accounts, these events appeared shocking. How could a Rockefeller lose so much? Yet those who looked more carefully recognized that Edith had never been driven by accumulating wealth. She had spent much of her life searching for something money could never purchase. Financial decline was painful, but it was not what defined her final years. Loneliness did. Many of the people who had eagerly sought her company during the height of her social influence quietly disappeared as her public image changed. Invitations became less frequent. The crowds grew smaller. Fame, she discovered, often leaves more quickly than fortune. In the end, the daughter of John D. Rockefeller was living not in one of the grand residences that had once symbolized American prosperity, but in a hotel where expenses were managed carefully and each week demanded practical decisions that would have seemed unimaginable during her youth. It remains one of history's great ironies that a woman born into the greatest fortune of her age spent her final chapter living with financial uncertainty. Yet perhaps the greater irony lies elsewhere. Despite the headlines, despite the criticism, despite the losses that seemed to define her public story, Edith never abandoned the questions that had guided her since childhood. She continued believing that understanding the human spirit mattered more than preserving appearances. She continued searching for meaning where others saw only tragedy. And when she died in 1932 at the age of 60, The newspapers largely remembered the scandals, the fortune, and the eccentricities. They spoke far less about the mother who had spent decades trying to understand grief after burying two children, or the curious little girl who had once wondered why happiness could vanish even in the richest home in America. Nearly a century later, perhaps that is the real story. Not that Edith Rockefeller McCormick inherited one of the greatest fortunes the world has ever known, but that her life revealed a truth every generation eventually discovers. Wealth can build magnificent houses, but it cannot guarantee peace inside them. It can purchase the finest doctors, but it cannot promise one more tomorrow. It can open countless doors, but it cannot answer the deepest questions of the human heart. Those answers Edith spent a lifetime searching for. Whether she ultimately found them is something history cannot tell us. But her journey reminds us that behind every famous name is a human being carrying hopes, fears, and losses that money has never been able to erase. The years that followed unfolded with remarkable quiet. There were no dramatic announcements. No single morning when Edith suddenly realized her fortune was fading. Instead, it disappeared the way daylight slowly leaves an autumn afternoon. One estate required more money than expected. Another investment failed to deliver what advisors had promised. Expenses continued arriving with perfect reliability, while income became increasingly uncertain. One by one, difficult decisions replaced comfortable ones. Staff who had served the family for years quietly packed their belongings and left. Rooms that had once echoed with conversation stood empty for weeks. Gardens that had required entire teams of caretakers gradually became smaller. The changes were almost invisible to strangers, but Edith noticed every one of them. She remembered when every guest room had been occupied during holidays. She remembered evenings when music drifted through the halls until long after midnight. Now entire sections of magnificent homes remained silent. The silence reminded her of something she had learned years earlier. Houses never create happiness. They only hold the memories of those who once filled them. Eventually, even those houses disappeared. Selling them was not merely a financial decision. Each one held fragments of a life she could never reclaim. A child's footsteps racing down a staircase. A birthday celebration. Christmas mornings. Family portraits taken before anyone imagined how fragile those moments truly were. Buyers saw architecture. Edith saw memories. She signed the documents anyway. The newspapers noticed almost immediately. Once again, headlines appeared before facts. Reporters who had once celebrated the elegance of her homes now described their sale as evidence of failure. The public loved stories about fortunes being made. They loved stories about fortunes being lost even more. Few reporters asked what Edith thought. Fewer still asked what she had endured. Tragedy rarely fits inside a headline. Human beings even less so. She continued reading when she wished, traveling when she could, and pursuing ideas that fascinated her despite public opinion. Friends occasionally urged her to defend herself. She almost never did. There comes a point in life when explaining yourself to strangers feels like surrendering the little piece you have left. Edith seemed to understand that. She stopped trying to correct every rumor. Time, she believed, would eventually separate truth from noise. Whether history agreed with her no longer seemed to matter. As her health slowly declined, the crowds that once surrounded her quietly disappeared. Society has always been drawn to success, youth, and influence. It is less comfortable with loneliness, aging, and decline. Visitors became fewer. Invitations became rare. Yet those who did spend time with Edith during her later years described something newspapers almost never mentioned. They found a woman who remained endlessly curious. Conversation still drifted toward philosophy, music, psychology, literature, and the mysteries of human nature. She asked thoughtful questions. She listened carefully. She had lost much of what the world considered valuable, yet she had never lost her desire to understand people. Perhaps the curiosity had been the one possession no tragedy could ever take from her. When Edith Rockefeller McCormick died in 1932, many newspapers summarized her life with astonishing simplicity. They wrote about the Rockefeller fortune. They mentioned the divorce. Some referred to Carl Jung. Others focused on the wealth that had vanished. Few devoted more than a few paragraphs to the mother who had buried two children. Fewer still recognized the extraordinary courage required to continue searching for meaning after so much loss. History often remembers the visible parts of a person's life. The invisible battles are usually left for future generations to discover. Perhaps that is why Edith's story still speaks to us today. Not because she was one of the richest women America had ever known, but because her greatest struggles were the same struggles faced by millions who possessed far less. She loved. She lost. She questioned. She searched. She hoped. She kept moving forward even when answers refused to appear. Wealth made her famous. It was her humanity that made her unforgettable. Nearly a century has passed since Edith Rockefeller McCormick closed the final chapter of her remarkable life, yet her story continues to ask questions that every generation must eventually answer. What truly gives life meaning when success no longer satisfies? What remains after wealth, reputation, and certainty have all begun to fade? Can grief ever become something other than pain? Each listener may arrive at a different answer, but perhaps that is exactly what Edith would have wanted. She spent her entire life searching, not because she expected every mystery to be solved, but because she believed the search itself mattered. In the end, the greatest inheritance her father left her was never measured in dollars. It was the freedom to keep asking questions. And perhaps the greatest inheritance Edith leaves us is the reminder that a meaningful life is not defined by what we accumulate, but by the courage to keep seeking truth when easy answers no longer exist. If you enjoyed this journey into one of history's most fascinating lives, I invite you to continue exploring the remarkable stories that shaped our world. Here on Tilt and Chill, every episode uncovers extraordinary people, forgotten places, and enduring mysteries that remind us how rich, surprising, and inspiring human history can be. Thank you for spending this time with us. If this story moved you, consider subscribing and joining our growing community of curious minds. Until our next journey, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and never lose your sense of wonder.